They had come for samples and quick reconnaissance. They got neither. The first spear whistled past Steve's head and shattered against a rock with explosive force. "Contact!" Siebel shouted, raising her pulse rifle. From the ridgeline above them poured the Axeheads, a furious flock of avian aliens 6 feet tall and terrifyingly graceful. Their bodies were slender and powerful, covered in vibrant red and gold feathers that flashed like flames against the dark stone. Their heads were shaped like axe blades, sharp and elongated, topped with fierce mohawks of stiff feathers. Round, predatory eyes locked onto their prey with unnatural focus. Curved beaks clicked with rage, and their clawed hands and feet gripped the volcanic rock as if it were nothing. They moved like living lightning. Siebel and Steve opened fire. Blue energy bolts streaked through the ash-filled air, but the Axeheads were impossibly fast. They flipped, twisted, and dodged mid-sprint, their slender bodies bending like reeds in a hurricane. Not a single shot landed. "Impossible!" Steve growled, firing again. One Axehead leaped from a 30-foot ledge, feathers flaring, and hurled a spear with terrifying precision. The weapon slammed into Siebel's chest with enough force to crack stone. Her nano-suit absorbed the impact, flashing a warning across her, HUD, but the blow still knocked her backward. "They're too fast!" she shouted. The Axeheads closed the distance in heartbeats, screeching high-pitched battle cries that echoed across the mountains. Their claws scraped sparks from the rock as they sprinted. Steve grabbed Siebel's arm and pulled her into a desperate run down the steep volcanic slope. Lava glowed on both sides of their narrow path. One wrong step meant instant death. Behind them, the flock poured down the mountain like a wave of red death. Spear after spear flew. One grazed Steve's shoulder, spinning him halfway around. Another struck Siebel's leg, nearly tripping her. The nano-suits held, but the impacts were brutal, jarring every bone in their bodies. "There!" Steve pointed ahead. "Lava tube!" A dark, jagged opening yawned in the mountainside, an ancient tunnel left by flowing magma. They sprinted for it, sliding down the final loose scree slope and diving inside just as a volley of spears clattered against the entrance. Inside the lava tube, the world became narrow, dark, and suffocating. The walls were smooth black glass, still warm from ancient heat. The Axeheads shrieked outside, furious they could not fit their broad shoulders and axe-shaped heads into the tight passage. "Keep moving," Siebel urged, her voice echoing. They crouched and ran deeper into the tunnel, hearts pounding, breaths ragged. The ground trembled faintly from distant eruptions. For a moment, they allowed themselves to hope. That hope died when they reached the far end. Dozens of Axeheads were already waiting at the tunnel's exit, perched on rocks like vultures, spears raised, eyes gleaming with predatory intelligence. They had circled around the mountain faster than humanly possible. "Trapped," Steve whispered. The Axeheads began advancing into the mouth of the tube, claws scraping glass-like stone. Their feathers bristled, beaks clicked. Siebel's mind raced, then Steve's eyes lit up. "Back the way we came, and there was a crack halfway through. I saw light." They spun and sprinted back into the darkness. The Axeheads gave chase, screeching, their claws clicking rapidly against the tunnel floor. The sound was horrifyingly close. Steve spotted the faint beam of light, cutting through a fracture in the ceiling. "Cover me!" he shouted. Siebel turned and fired repeatedly down the tunnel, forcing the Axeheads to dodge and slow. Steve slapped a small explosive charge into the crack, set the timer, and yelled, "Go!" They ran. The explosion roared behind them. Rock shattered. The crack widened violently into a jagged opening just big enough for a person. No time to think. They climbed out and froze. They had emerged on the edge of a sheer cliff. Hundreds of feet below, a river of glowing lava snaked through the valley. Behind them, the axe heads were already climbing through the new opening, furious and closing fast. "No choice!" Steve yelled. They jumped. The fall was terrifying. Wind howled past their helmets. The ground rushed up. At the last second, their nano suits inflated into protective cocoons, absorbing the brutal impact as they tumbled and rolled across the rocky slope. Bruised, but alive, they scrambled to their feet. Siebel lifted her binoculars and scanned the ridge above. Her stomach dropped. "The axe heads have split into 2 groups," she said urgently. "One is coming down after us. The other is heading straight for the lander." Steve's face hardened. "They're trying to trap us here." They broke into a dead sprint across the volcanic terrain, leaping over glowing cracks, dodging falling ash and sliding down steep slopes. Every breath burned. Their suits were scarred and scorched. Behind them, the pursuing axe heads bounded from rock to rock, gaining ground with terrifying speed. Siebel tried to remote start the lander. "Out of range!" she shouted. The lander sat on a distant plateau, vulnerable. If the second group reached it first, Siebel and Steve would be stranded on this deadly world forever. The chase intensified. Spears whistled past them. One axe head leaped from a cliff edge above, soaring like a red demon, claws extended. Steve fired upward, mid-run, forcing it to twist away at the last second. The volcanic mountain rumbled ominously, as if the planet itself wanted them dead. Siebel and Steve ran harder than they had ever run in their lives, hearts thundering, lungs burning, with an entire flock of axe-headed death closing in from 2 directions. The volcanic world roared around them like an angry god. Siebel and Steve sprinted across the jagged black ridges, lungs burning, legs screaming with exhaustion. Behind them, the first group of axe heads bounded down the slope like crimson lightning, leaping from rock to rock with impossible agility. Their colourful feathers flashed in the hellish glow of flowing lava, their axe-shaped heads cutting through the ash-filled air as they closed the distance. "Faster!" Steve shouted. The lander sat on a distant plateau, a silver disk glinting against the blood-red sky. But as they drew closer, dread hit them both at once. The second group had already arrived. Dozens of axe heads swarmed around their craft, spears raised, talons scraping across the hull as they searched for a way inside. One of them slammed a spear against the landing gear with such force it left a visible dent. Siebel skidded to a stop on the ridgeline. "They're already there." Steve didn't hesitate. He activated the remote override on his wrist display. The lander's engines hummed to life, slowly lifting off the plateau. But the terrain was treacherous. Sharp volcanic spines and sheer drops surrounded them. The craft could not land close enough without risking a crash. "Damn it! Too jagged!" Steve growled. A blood-chilling screech echoed behind them. The pursuing axe heads had caught up. Spears rained down like deadly hail. One slammed into Siebel's back, the impact throwing her forward. Another struck Steve's thigh, spinning him halfway around. The nano-suits held, but the sheer kinetic force felt like being hit by a sledgehammer. "Steve, I'm getting tired," Siebel gasped, her breathing ragged. The constant running, the heat, the adrenaline, it was draining her faster than she could recover. Steve's face hardened with determination. "Then we do this the hard way." He guided the lander remotely, bringing the craft dangerously close along the narrow ridge. With expert precision, he dropped it below the ridgeline, tilting the entire vessel sideways so the open hatch faced them like a gaping mouth. "Get ready to jump." The axe heads were only seconds away, leaping from boulder to boulder, spears already drawn back for the kill. "Now!" Steve roared. Siebel and Steve sprinted the final distance and leaped off the edge of the cliff. For one terrifying heartbeat, they were airborne, the glowing lava river far below. They sailed straight into the open hatch of the tilted lander. They crashed hard inside the cargo bay, tumbling across the deck. A split second later, a spear shot through the open door like a missile, embedding itself deep into the opposite wall just inches from Siebel's head. The axe head that threw it shrieked in rage from the ridge above. "Close the hatch!" Siebel yelled. Steve slammed the remote command. The door hissed shut, just as more spears clattered uselessly against the hull. The lander's engines screamed as they accelerated away, leaving the furious flock behind. They didn't stop to celebrate. "Take us to the other side of the planet," Siebel said, collapsing into the co-pilot seat. "Maybe the inhabitants there are more peaceful." Steve nodded grimly and piloted the craft high above the volcanic hellscape. The planet was massive and violently active, but as they crossed to the far hemisphere, the landscape changed. The volcanoes gave way to darker, colder mountains shrouded in thick mist. They set the lander down in a narrow valley beside an absolutely colossal rock formation, a single, sheer pillar of black stone rising like a skyscraper from the earth. Its walls were nearly vertical, impossibly smooth and steep. Climbing it by hand would be suicide. "Let's send the drone up," Steve suggested. "We need to know what's on top before we go exploring." The small reconnaissance drone hummed upward, its camera feeding live images to their console. As it reached the summit, they both leaned in closer. On top of the skyscraper-like rock was a massive nest, a carefully constructed platform of sharp sticks pointing outward like a crown of thorns, topped with a thick bed of dry grass and leaves. Curled protectively in the center was a single female axe head. Her feathers were a softer shade of crimson and gold. She was curled tightly around a large, speckled egg, her axe-shaped head resting gently against it. "It's a nest," Siebel whispered. The female axe head suddenly stirred. Her round eyes snapped open with predatory alertness. In one fluid motion she snatched a spear from the edge of the nest and hurled it with terrifying accuracy. The drone camera exploded in a shower of sparks. The feed went dead. Steve cursed, frantically guiding the damaged drone back down. It spun wildly but managed to limp back into the lander's cargo bay. "That was a warning shot," Siebel said. Before they could react, the female axe head let out a piercing, haunting bird-like call that echoed across the mountains. The sound was answered from multiple directions. "They're coming," Steve said. They quickly stepped outside to collect surface samples, working as fast as possible. The air was cooler here, but tension hung thick. Siebel had just sealed a rock sample when the ground began to tremble, not from a volcano, but from hundreds of clawed feet. A massive war party of axe heads burst over the nearest ridge, feathers blazing, spears raised high. Their battle cries shook the valley. "Back to the lander!" Steve shouted. The chase was on again. Siebel and Steve sprinted toward their craft as the axe heads poured down the slopes from all sides. Spears whistled past them, some bouncing off their suits. One axe head took a daring leap from a high ledge, landing directly in front of Siebel. She fired her pulse rifle at point-blank range. The creature twisted at the last millisecond, the bolt burning only a few feathers, then slashed at her with razor claws. Steve tackled the axe head from the side, buying Siebel a precious second. They both dove into the lander. Steve slammed the hatch shut as spears hammered against the hull like machine gun fire. "Get us out of here!" Siebel yelled. The engines roared. The lander lifted violently, scraping against the skyscraper rock as they climbed. Below them, the axe heads screeched in fury, leaping desperately into the air as if they could still reach them. As the craft climbed higher into the red sky, Siebel stared down at the retreating figures. "These aren't just warriors," she said quietly. "They're defending their homes, their children." Steve gripped the controls tightly. "Then let's not give them a reason to follow us any further." The lander streaked away from the towering nest rock, leaving the axe heads and their volcanic world behind. The volcanic fury of the Axe-Head continent faded behind them as Steve pushed the lander across the planet's curvature. They flew low over a vast, restless ocean, the largest body of water they had ever seen on any world. Towering waves crashed against jagged black shores while steam rose where lava met seawater. After hours of tense silence, a lone island appeared on the horizon, a green jewel surrounded by violent surf. "No axe-heads," Siebel said, scanning the terrain. "This might be our chance to breathe." They set the lander down on a black sand beach nestled between two steep cliffs. The air was heavy with salt and strange floral perfume. Towering palm-like trees with blood-red fronds swayed gently. For the first time since landing on this nightmare planet, everything felt almost peaceful. They stepped out cautiously, weapons ready, and began collecting samples, exotic plants, strange minerals, and water from a crystal-clear stream. For nearly 20 minutes, nothing disturbed them. Then came the humming. At first, it sounded like distant insects. Then it grew louder, a high-pitched, vibrating drone that filled the air. Siebel looked up. The sky above the tree line was darkening, not with clouds, with creatures. Hundreds of hummingbird-like aliens swarmed toward them. Each one was the size of a large hawk, with iridescent metallic feathers that shifted between deep crimson and electric violet. Their long, needle-sharp beaks gleamed like surgical blades. Tiny red eyes locked onto Siebel and Steve with ravenous hunger. These were not birds, they were bloodsuckers. "Back to the lander!" Steve shouted. The swarm descended like a living storm. Siebel and Steve sprinted across the black sand as the hummingbirds dove at terrifying speed. One latched onto Steve's shoulder, its beak piercing the nano-suit's outer layer before he ripped it off and crushed it under his boot. Another stabbed at Siebel's neck. She spun and fired her pulse rifle on wide dispersal, burning several out of the air in a flash of blue light. But there were too many. The creatures moved with impossible agility, darting and hovering like living bullets. Their high-pitched screeches mixed with the constant vibrating hum created a disorienting wall of sound. One landed on Siebel's helmet, its beak scraping loudly against her visor as it tried to find a weak point. She slammed her head against a tree trunk to dislodge it. "They're after blood!" she yelled. Steve grabbed her arm and pulled her toward a narrow ravine between the cliffs. "This way! Tighter space!" They sprinted into the ravine as the swarm poured in after them. The walls were steep and covered in slick moss. Spears of sunlight cut through the canopy above. The hummingbirds attacked from every angle, diving, stabbing, trying to drain them dry. Steve fired blindly behind them while running, lighting up the ravine with pulse fire. Burnt hummingbirds rained down around them. Siebel's suit began flashing multiple breach warnings. Small punctures were appearing. She could feel warm blood trickling down her arm from a successful stab. "We're not going to make it back to the lander like this," she shouted. Steve spotted a narrow cave opening halfway up the ravine wall. "Up there!" They climbed desperately, hands slipping on wet rock, as the swarm swirled below them like a living tornado. Steve boosted Siebel up, then pulled himself in after her. They crawled deep into the narrow cave, just wide enough for their bodies. The hummingbirds tried to follow, but couldn't fit more than a few at a time. Steve blasted the entrance repeatedly until the swarm finally retreated, screeching in frustration. They waited in the darkness, breathing hard, listening to the angry hum outside. After nearly an hour, the sound finally faded. They emerged cautiously, made a desperate sprint across the beach, and reached the lander. The moment the hatch sealed, Steve launched them into orbit without hesitation. "Enough of this planet," he muttered. The journey back through the wormhole was quiet. When they finally docked at the International Space Station orbiting Earth, Siebel felt something she rarely allowed herself to feel: relief. She had spent nearly half her life on this station. These metallic corridors, the hum of life support systems, the view of the blue planet slowly turning below. It felt more like home than anywhere else in the galaxy. They walked together toward the debriefing room, suits still scorched and scarred from the axe heads and bloodsuckers. General Race was waiting, arms crossed, face stern as always. "Report," he demanded. Siebel and Steve gave a full account: the hostile axe-heads, their incredible speed and aggression, the blood-sucking hummingbird swarm, the narrow escapes, and the impossible terrain. Race listened, without interrupting. When they finished, he leaned back in his chair. "This planet is to be classified as hostile," he said firmly. "No further missions, no attempts at contact. We stay clear." Siebel nodded slowly. "I agree, sir." Steve glanced at her, then back at Rice. "Agreed. That world doesn't want us there, and we have no business forcing the issue." Race studied them both for a long moment, his eyes lingering on Siebel a second longer than usual. "Dismissed. Get some rest. You've earned it." As they walked out of the debriefing room, Siebel paused at the large observation window overlooking Earth. The blue planet glowed peacefully below them. Steve stood beside her. "Think we'll ever find a world peaceful enough for the assist eggs?" he asked quietly. Siebel didn't answer right away. She touched the small container secured at her side, the last hope of an entire species. "I don't know," she whispered, "but we keep looking." Far behind them, on the volcanic world they had barely escaped, a lone axe-head stood atop a skyscraper-like rock, watching the sky with sharp, unblinking eyes. Its feathers rippled in the wind as it let out one final, haunting cry. Some planets are not meant to be explored. They are only meant to be survived.